Oh, thank you so much, Callie, and for such a nice introduction. Um, Nowadays, very much my identity is mostly as a publisher, as publishing Jewish Renaissance. But I'm so lucky. I was just saying, Callie, this is actually my first week at Oxford. I started on Tuesday, and I am in this program about writing Jewish women's lives. Um, and one of the reasons that I am their first scholar is because something I've been doing over the years, kind of informally, is collecting stories about Jewish women who have appeared in the biographies of major male creatives, as a kind of addition or tangent. But actually, in their own right, they were superb. And you're going to discover this because one of the things I'm leading up to with my 3 weeks on Shakespeare is to looking at the woman who was the Dark Lady, who I think I'm not even going to say any more is kind of thought to be as the best candidate for. I really think by now we've proved it beyond doubt. And she was not only a Jewish woman, but she was the second woman in England to have work published and actually the first published poet. So I'm starting with Shakespeare, and this is very much about Shakespeare at the Jews. But I'm going to take you around over the next 3 weeks, a series of people he knew, and really show how significant Jews were in his life and in the influences on his writing. Um, a lot of us know Shakespeare. And I was reading recently Dara Horn. Do you know her book about people love dead Jews? I'm sure many people here know it. There's a lot of really great writing in there, and actually, I would say great polemical writing, drawing on literary sources. But the one chapter I absolutely took issue with was her chapter on Shakespeare, because its thesis is absolutely, of course, Shakespeare is anti Semitic. The Merchant of Venice is so obviously an anti Semitic play. People can argue all they want about context, about Shylock's speeches, but Dara Horn writes in it, she turns around to her young son, I think at the time he's about 11, and says, "What do you make of this play?" And he goes, "Well, obviously he's anti-Semitic and he hates Jews." And she said, if even an 11-year-old, even her young son can see it, what is even the debate? And on one hand, you see how Jewish I am. On one hand, my answer to that is, of course. There is absolutely no question that there are anti-Semitic depictions in Shakespeare's work. On the other hand, and I'm going to quote someone here. So in 2016, which was the 500th anniversary of the Venice Ghetto, as well as the anniversary of Shakespeare's first folio, there was a production in Venice of The Merchant of Venice. Ruth Bader Ginsburg came and she acted actually as the judge because they retried Shylock. They had a law case. So Ruth came as the judge. Howard Jacobson, one of our great British novelists, came along to advise them. He's written novels about Shylock. And also Stephen Greenblatt, who is one of the leading Shakespearean professors, were there. And Howard Jacobson interviewed Stephen Greenblatt. So the great British esteemed author interviewing the great Shakespearean scholar, by the way, both of whom are Jews. And I would say all the great Shakespearean scholars of the moment are Jews. James Shapiro, Janet Edelman, are you noticing a theme here? There's something very interesting going on. But Howard turned to Stephen and he says, "Is this an anti-Semitic play?" And Stephen kind of looked at him and he went, "Well, yes, but nevertheless." And it's that kind of nevertheless that I'm going to explore today. Because how many of us, or how many of you like me, um, came home from school after reading Shylock's speech for the first time, thinking this is the greatest challenge to anti-Semitism I have ever read. I remember having this huge discussion with my mother and grandmother about it, both of whom thought that Shylock was a hero. And coming into my class the next day when I was the only Jewish girl in a room of 30, and everyone was booing him. So, I think for all of us, it's a very complicated perception. So, what I'm going to do today is dig into that and dig into that nevertheless and that complexity. And I think the only way to do that is to look at the historical context, because what we read now and how things sound now versus how they would have sounded in the moment of Shakespeare's writing are very different. But also looking at the play, how the play has been used, as well as why it was constructed, kind of gives us that so much more complex response than, of course. So today I am going to particularly dig in to The Merchant of Venice, but I'm going to do so through history, through the lens of history, looking at how and why people have used it to challenge their own moments of prejudice in society, and then use that as an example to go back to Shakespeare and say, okay, so what's the context he's working in? And how does his own life and his own understanding of Jewishness come into that writing of the play? If I manage my timing correctly, I'm going to end by showing you how important I think the place Shakespeare was living at the time that he wrote it was to his writing of the play. And then next week, I'm going to widen it out because I'm going to have a look at the whole geography of that part of London, not only how it influenced Shakespeare's life and the people he met and the plays, but how important it was to the poetry and the sonnets and what he was doing then, and how the Jewishness of that area was important. Okay. And then I'm going to take you into by the time we get to week 3, the Jews, and there were Jews who were living around him, who were his neighbours, his friends, his colleagues, what they influenced, the influence they had on his writing, but also who they were in their own right, and how by looking at them we learn so much more about Jewish identity, and also Jews in literature in England, in British literature maybe. Let's go from just England to Britain, because that's where I'm from. So that's the plan for the 3 weeks. Some of you have met me before, and I did a series in the summer on women. And I'm going to start off actually with a slide I showed you in my final session. So let me just share my screen. Is everyone seeing this? Okay. So when I last saw some of you, I was discussing Sarah Bernhardt. And I told you how my interest in her was sparked when I was working on a Shakespeare exhibition at the British Library in London. And we were debating which skull to use to represent the skull of Yorick in the room that was all about Hamlet. And the decision was the skull that Sarah Bernhardt used. And you can see it here in this image of her. And then you can see it again here. This is one of my friends and colleagues who was associate curating that exhibition, placing it on the stand. And this was the skull given to Sarah Bernhardt, the Jewish actress, by Victor Hugo. So that moment got me completely obsessed with Sarah Bernhardt. But it also made me think about all the ways Jews are related to Shakespeare. And here I was standing in this room where we were building basically a shrine to Hamlet. We had all the Hamlet first folios, we had the skull, we had the quarto, so we had all the various texts of Hamlet as they developed. We had images of the theatres in which Hamlet was played. We had picture upon picture of actor playing Hamlet, the devotion that was given to this play. and not a single item in the whole exhibition referred to the Merchant of Venice because the curators were too scared to take it on, which tells you something. That's how I got involved, actually, because they hadn't addressed it. And yet, in almost every school classroom in the UK, it was being studied. So when they did their learning resources on the website to go with the exhibition, they had to look at the Merchant of Venice. Rather than asking one of the Shakespeareans on staff to write it, they asked me because I was the only Jew in the room at the time. So my PhD isn't on Shakespeare, although some of it is related in the period. It's some of the poets he knew and were slightly later than him, the metaphysical poets. But I ended up doing quite a big dive into the Merchant of Venice. And what happened then was I got involved in some of the other conversations. I became an educator on the exhibition. We had all sorts of conversations. And as material was being put into this big exhibition, I was thinking the whole time about the Merchant of Venice and Jewishness. And just like I did with making the link with Sarah Bernhardt's skull, my question was always, how did this relate to Jews? So what you're going to see along the way when I give you historical sources are sources that are absolutely first-hand documents. Many of them were brought into the public eye in 2016. They'd maybe had been known about tangentially, but when that exhibition was building, when that anniversary of the first folio was being marked, a whole load of extra research was done. So we are now 9 years on, and since that moment, these documents we've had a chance to think about, to contextualize. So I'm going to take you one step on from where I was in 2016. But this is really kind of, if not new material, it's new thinking and rephrasing with a whole different context, some very important historical sources. Okay, so let's go on. Let's look at this. The skull, I think, is important. The face is important. I'm a words girl. You're going to have loads of words in these 3-week sessions. But I'm going to start actually with some pictures. So I want to start with a picture of Shakespeare. There are several portraits, a couple of sculptures, and a lino cut that seem to date to the time Shakespeare lived. There is a whole industry in proving whether these portraits were in his lifetime, if he posed with them or not. There's a recently discovered one in Ireland, which has a whole debate about, has created a whole debate about his sexuality and his understanding of gender. You know, there's a sculpture in a church that's been used to debate his religion. But if we want to actually look at his face and see him, of all the images of him, this is thought to be the one most likely to have been painted from life. The reason we know this is there is a mirror image portrait with the same background, clearly by the same artist, that was painted of Richard Burbage, who was the lead actor in his company. In fact, Burbage's father was one of the great funders of Shakespeare's company. So that portrait had stayed in the family for many years, has a very, very good provenance. This one has also a good provenance, though not quite as good, but it's almost as good. So it seems very clear that someone, possibly a member of their company who was a set painter, did paintings of Shakespeare and of Burbage at the time. So if you want to see an image of Shakespeare, this is probably your one. So much so that when the National Portrait Gallery in London was founded, this was the first portrait that was acquired. Okay, so this was the opening portrait for the UK's National Portrait Gallery. At the time that we were doing the exhibition, I had a chat to one of the National Portrait Gallery curators about how they proved this provenance and why they think it's Shakespeare so clearly, but also what it as a painting tells us. Okay. So the provenance is it was owned by the Duke of Chandos and it was pretty much passed down through his family. He acquired it in the 1600s, so there is a short gap, but we can tell the dating of the paints and of the materials. It's pretty clear that it dates between 1600 and 1610 when Shakespeare was alive. And there are a few things that seem to suggest it's Shakespeare. So one is the earring, okay? Can you see that single earring? It seems to be that portraits of poets and writers from this period, one of the things that signifies they're a writer is this single earring. If you look at a painting of John Donne, which is also in the National Portrait Gallery from a very similar time, which is fully, the provenance is absolutely stellar. There is not a question or a doubt that it was John Donne and it was painted from life. He also has the single earring. Okay. The next thing that seems to suggest it's Shakespeare is the collar. Okay, so that open neck collar with a string, unlike the fancy lords and ladies you might have seen Queen Elizabeth I with her ruff. You do get some pictures of Shakespeare looking at that, but that was really a nobility thing.
Aviva,
This,
could you pull
yeah.
that picture back up for us so we can see as you're talking about it?
Ah, are you not seeing it?
No.
Oh, hold on a minute, because it's saying on my computer I'm sharing it. Let me try again. Can you see it now?
Yes, great.
Fantastic. Sorry about that. Shout to me because as far as I know, I've got my slides up the whole time. So if there's anything you're not seeing, shout at me and we'll try that again. So absolutely, do you see now the single earring I'm talking about? Okay. Can you see the collar? The open collar. It's white lace, but it's open and it's got a string. Okay. So Tanya Cooper, who did the kind of deep dive into this, researched that, and that kind of loose shirt tie was something that was popularized by the Earl of Pembroke, who was one of Shakespeare's patrons. So this is another clue that it's Shakespeare. And one of the other clues, the third clues, is that it's a black top that he's wearing and that his hair is represented with deep black dye. Okay, so dye is expensive. This is not a member of the nobility, this is someone middle class, but it is someone with means. That black dye is an indicator that not only is Shakespeare has money, but the painter who's been commissioned to paint him has money for the paints. And this is all indicating someone wealthy, middle class, creative, and a writer. Okay. Why am I telling you this in such depth? Well, not just because it might have served as the basis for the engraved portrait of Shakespeare that I'm going to come to in the first folio, but because when the National Portrait Gallery opens in 1856, not a single one of the Victorian critics are willing to own that this really is Shakespeare. And their reason? He looks too much like a Jew. Okay. So this is George Stevens. He has the complexion of a Jew, or rather that of a chimney sweeper in the jaundice. James Hayne Friswell. One cannot readily imagine our essentially English Shakespeare to have been a dark, heavy man with a foreign expression of a decidedly Jewish physiognomy, thin curly hair, a somewhat lubricious mouth, red-edged eyes, wanton lips, with a coarse expression, and his ears tricked out with earrings. Can you all feel the reeking prejudice coming off this statement? Okay. Shakespeare's foreignness is anathema to the English. And I think this is very interesting because when we look at Shakespeare, and we're about to look at him in a little while, Shakespeare writing Jews, Shakespeare writing foreigners, it's worth keeping in mind that he might not have been so easily accepted by the Englishmen around him. Okay. And that reeking prejudice we see in Victorian England was also there in Elizabethan and Jacobean England where he lived. I'm going to show you another one. Okay. So Ernest Jones is a biographer, and this is a little bit later. So in 1961, Ernest Jones publishes a biography of a very famous man who has come to England as a refugee from the Holocaust, from Vienna, and living in England goes to the National Portrait Gallery, sees the picture of Shakespeare, and because he's Jewish, he doesn't give an anti-Semitic perspective, but he's absolutely positive he can't be an Anglo-Saxon Englishman. So he, and I'm going to tell you who that he is in a moment, insisted that his countenance could not be that of an Anglo-Saxon, but must be French. And he suggested that the name was a corruption of Shakespeare. Okay. Can you see how much is read into Shakespeare? Okay. So who is that he? Anyone in the room know who Ernest Jones is the biographer of? Anyone want to put anything in the chat? No? Okay. Sigmund Freud. Okay. So Sigmund Freud, from not just his picture, but his writing, cannot believe that Shakespeare is an Englishman. Okay. So just to put that in context, this is the more commonly used image of Shakespeare. It has the bald head and the hair. It's very similar to a very bad sculpture that is in a church near Warwick, near Stratford-on-Avon, where Shakespeare's family lived. But what's really interesting to me is, so this is the first publication of all of Shakespeare's plays. And Ben Jonson, can you see the BI? That's Ben Jonson, the English poet and playwright, who is a friend of Shakespeare, writes an introductory poem to it. So the plays are gathered together by Hemming and Condell, two actors who've been in Shakespeare's players, and they asked Ben Jonson to give it authority by writing a sonnet to mark it. This, what is known as the first folio, this first complete collection of Shakespeare's plays, although again that word complete is misleading, and I'll show you some historical material to that. This is the authoritative source for all the plays, including Merchant of Venice. I will show you another quarto a little bit later, and in a couple of weeks' time I'm going to show you a quarto of The Taming of the Shrew. These are all known as false quartos or bad quartos because they have mistakes or changes in them between that and the first folio. And the first folio is what everyone goes with. But actually, I don't think there's such a thing as a bad quarto. It's just an earlier version, probably from some early playings of the play. So those bad quartos are actually probably more true to what was happening on stage at the time. But anyway, we'll come to that. I'm showing it you because the sonnet that Ben Jonson writes to introduce it laughs at how bad the picture is. So he starts with, to the reader, this figure that thou here sees put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the engraver, had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit as well as in brass, as well he has hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. So Ben Jonson is basically doing a really big diss, as I'd use in British slang, to Martin Hut, who does this engraving. And he says, if you want to know the man, don't look at the picture of him, look at his writing. Don't look at his picture, look at his book. So here's all these images of Shakespeare that get taken for a Jew. What happens when we do look at his writing? Well, we get speeches like, I am a Jew, that I reference at the beginning. I would imagine absolutely everyone in the audience knows this speech. So rather than read it, I'm going to have Al Pacino perform it for us. So let's just play Al Pacino and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
I'm sure if you forfeit, you will not take his flesh. What's that good for?
To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies, and what's his reason? I am a Jew! Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands? Organs? Dimensions? Senses? Affections? Passions? Fed with the same food? Hurt with the same weapons? Subject to the same diseases? Healed by the same means? Warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge? If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be? By Christian example. Why revenge? The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction.
Okay. Thank you, Al. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. This might be foolish, but I think we've got time for a little bit of interaction. I know I'll regret it in week 3 when I'll still have so much material to give you. But I don't just want to lecture at you. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes today in a couple of minutes unpicking why I think Shakespeare wrote that speech, okay? But before I do, I'd love to hear from some of you what you think about that speech. What is it doing in a play that's written in the late 1500s? How do you as a Jew respond to it? How do you think your non-Jewish friends and colleagues viewing the play respond to Shylock? What's going on here?
I've just given everyone the ability to unmute themselves. If you also want to raise your hand so we know who's going, that's great too. Okay, we have our first person, Tybell, if you want to unmute yourself and give us your opinion.
It's not quite what you asked for, but I'm struck by the fact that the biggest college at Oxford was funded by the confiscation of Jewish property. The library at Balliol, which is the only library I've seen, has more Judaic treasures. But as you have this new, you said, affiliation with Oxford, has it changed your perception, knowing how much of Oxford was built on Jewish suffering?
Okay, so I will take that quickly and move back to Shakespeare. But funnily enough, I had just this discussion on Tuesday because I'm a fellow at Wolfson College. Note the surname. It's a modern college at Oxford. And Professor Avi Schleim, a historian, complicated politics historian, but anyway, came up to me and said to me, do I know the only two colleges at Oxford and Cambridge which were named after Jews? Who were the two Jewish men they were named after? Because each one has a Jewish college. And he said he'd had this conversation with Isaiah Berlin when they were founded. And they'd been laughing because one was Isaac Wolfson and one was Leonard Wolfson. So he said he and Isaiah Berlin always had a fondness for Wolfson College. But he didn't give me the answer. He turned around to me and he said, what are the Jewish colleges? Like which two Jewish men are the Oxbridge colleges named after? And I said, well, I don't know the second, but the first one has to be Jesus. Um, it's complicated being a Jew in the British establishment. For me, the fact that there is a new program at Oxford, I was interviewing for this position 18 months ago, and when I went to do my interview and my initial presentation seminar, which they viewed, I was walking past the front of the Natural History and Pitt Rivers Museum to go to the college, and the green in front of the museums were filled with encampments and boards and slogans, like I think every university in America. So it's complicated. The fact that at the same time, a Jewish Women's Voices programme, the first one in the UK, was being founded, tells us it's a complex story. So I'm giving that on the one hand and on the other hand, because that's how I feel about Shakespeare. Anti-Semitic, yes, of course. Nevertheless, how complicated that Oxford has collected all this Jewish treasure. Nevertheless, it means that if I want to research the Venetian Jewish musicians who Henry VIII brought to England and talk about their lives, where do I find the material? In an Oxford college and in the Bodleian Library. It's everything is double-sided. So thank you for that. Let's go back. Talking about that double-sided, let's go to Shylock. So Clifford, should I bring you on?
Yeah, thank you. I argue that this play works best as a three-act tragedy. The last two acts had to be there because that was the form that theater took in that time, and certainly there's brilliant material in the last two acts, the quality of Mercy's speech and such. But to me, the downfall of Shylock should be where the play ends. That's a personal approach. I wonder what the Elizabethan audience thought about that speech, and I wonder how many of them, for the first time, confronted the fact that Jews are like Christians in all these fundamental ways. And I wonder how many of them walked out of the play ashamed of the fact that they laughed at the comedy, the comedic takedown of Shylock's in the end. I think it's difficult for even our contemporary audience of primarily Christians to deal with the anti-Semitism, and I think that speech is one of the most brilliant ever written. Obviously, I could, it's interesting. I do the quality of the Mercy speech before I hand out my student evaluation forms at the end of the semester, and some students afterwards say, "You're Jewish and you can quote the Merchant of Venice," and I point them back to the speech that you highlighted from Pacino. I just think I don't know that means he's Jewish, but he certainly had an insight into what it's like to be on the outside, what it likes to be marginalized, what it likes to be shunned for who he is, not for what he does. Thank you.
100%. Thank you for summarising it so brilliantly. So I'm not the one of the people who goes Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, and I'm not one of the people who goes he had a hidden life, that he was he a hidden Catholic, was he a hidden Jew, whatever. What I do think is he knew Jews, he knew other refugees, and this is what my 3 weeks is going to be about. And he himself was marginalized for other reasons. And so he emotionally understands it. So I will come back to that. Thank you for that. And also thank you to the person who privately messaged me in the chat saying, is this related to the Inquisition and leaving Spain and Portugal, the Jewish immigrant experience? Yes, and more. And I promise I'll come to that hopefully today, but if not, next week. Thank you. Clifford, I'm going to take you off, and I'm very aware of time and there's lots of people. So I'm just going to take one more in order now, but I might bring some of you back if we've got time at the end to do questions and Q&A. Rather than doing Q&A, what I'm going to do is invite Howard, Mitch, Eve, Kenneth, Dina, etc. to be part of that chat then. But I'll just take Ellen.
Sorry, if that's the case, we do have a lot of people asking the same question that I think it would be great to answer, which is, as you were saying, how did Shakespeare, what is the historical context in terms of Jewish history in the UK at this time and the fact that they weren't allowed to be practicing?
Promise you, that is exactly what some of today and all of next week and the week after are about. Promise you. Let's just take Ellen for her view and then we'll continue on.
Okay, well, not as educated as the other two comments, but for the first time ever, when I heard Al Pacino say the speech, it seemed to before when I heard the speech, it seemed more of a sort of a haughty, like I am a Jew, proud. But this interpretation seemed more angry that Jews were so ill-treated, and I'm sure that was the case, but it was, I guess it was more of a pedantic type of interpretation before. It was, I am a Jew, like, what's the difference? But this was more like, I'm angry that I'm being treated this way. And what is my recourse? So that's all I have to say.
But I think that is brilliant. So thank you, because I think this is a play about anger. This is not a play about mercy. A lot of people talk about that speech, the quality of mercy. By the way, a lot of people also go, oh yes, this is clearly Christian theology. It's straight
Morning. Hang on a second, please.
Straight from Deuteronomy, from Devarim. But I don't think this is a play about mercy. I think this is a play about anger. So I think that's a really, really good point. Thank you. And in fact, to prove that, what I'm going to do is just continue on. So let me show you. Well, actually, I'll come back to the anger bit. I wanted to show you, though, the complexity of how we view it, because we are all going, well, yes, it gives Jews a voice. That I'm a Jew gives the Jews a voice. Of course, it was also being used for anti-Semitic propaganda. So this was the Nazi Party production in Vienna in 1943. So one critic, and I'm going to tell you who that critic was in a minute, said that the play offered, and this is a quote, a pathological image of the East European Jewish type, expressing all its inner and outer uncleanliness. Who was that critic? Joseph Goebbels. Okay. He loved The Merchant of Venice because he agreed with the anti-Semitism. He thought it showed how venal the Jews were. And it was one of the projects that were last projects on his desk before the Allies won. This was one of the things he wanted to do, was turn the play into a film, as a propaganda film against the Jews. Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, exactly what Clifford was talking about, this kind of, but it's expressing that Jewish cry, that Jewish challenge. Let's go to 1946. And here's a Yiddish production in London. So there's been Yiddish productions actually in America as well as in Europe since about the 1890s. But for me, what struck me was 1946. It's being played in London. The Yiddish actor Meir Zelniker and his daughter Anna, who play Portia, their father and daughter, hire a non-Jewish director because they want it to address non-Jews as well as Jews. And why did they do it in 1946? So this was an interview that John Gross got from people in the cast. He wrote a book about it in 1992. And some of the very young cast members said the Zelniker's attitude was, we are still here. 1946, we're still here. We've survived. We're not afraid to confront the Merchant of Venice with all its anti-Semitic problems. We are doing it to confront anti-Semitism and what has happened to Jews and like how they respond. So isn't it interesting? This is what I mean about anger. It's coming out of this moment of fury at the Holocaust. This is what anti-Semitism is. There's another play I'm going to show you as well. So this is a little bit earlier. This is 1879. So this is Sir Henry Irving, and he played Shylock, okay? He played Shylock with Ellen Terry as his Portia. And it was a seminal production in England. Why? Because before he performed the play, he was on a cruise and he met a Jewish merchant on that cruise and got talking to him about it. And the Jewish merchant said to him exactly what you guys have just been saying to me. This is not a play about anti-Semitism. It's a play about how we respond to it, that we are human too. And Henry Irving said, actually, what this play shows us is when there's undeserved persecution, trauma begets trauma, hurt people hurt people. It's an amazing psychological approach. And that's what he plays with Ellen Terry, two non-Jews, okay? What has made the difference in him playing it, going from Shylock as a raging villain to Shylock as someone humane and traumatized by anti-Semitism? That Henry Irving has met Jews. And that's what changes his portrayal. And that, for me, is so key to Shakespeare. So I want to show you what I think is going on a little bit with Shakespeare writing this, and writing it in a way that it seems to say, the villainy you teach me. If I'm a villain, it's because you Christians have created me as that villain with your persecution. So we all know this scene. I wanted to perform it, but actually there isn't time, and I think you want some more history. But look at all this. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, spit upon my Jewish gabardine. You spurned me. You called me dog. You want me to lend you money. You want me to help you out, but look how you treat me. And Antonio, the Christian merchant who's asking Shylock to lend him money to save him, doesn't say, I'm sorry, give me the money. He says, lend me the money, but yeah, I'm likely to do this again, to spit on you again, to spurn you too. That's just how we treat Jews. I've never seen a more viscerally clear example of bullying. Have you? So, let's think about this. Why would Shakespeare portray an evil merchant mistreating a moneylender? Welcome to Shakespeare's father. So this is where I'm going to go a little bit Freudian. So this is one of the documents that we pulled out. There'd been some initial research on it at the turn of the century, but we pulled out in 2016 when we were doing that exhibition. We were looking at the history of William Shakespeare's family, and what do we find in the National Archives but a record of a fine paid by his father for committing the crime of usury or moneylending. Shakespeare is the son of a moneylender. Let me prove that, because it's not what the normal biographers say about Shakespeare's father. So Shakespeare's father, the normal description you get is that he's an English businessman, he's a politician, active in Stratford-upon-Avon, he becomes the alderman, he's a glover and a leather worker by his trade. He actually has a factory, a glove-making factory. Who is he lending money to? Quite a lot of the people he's lending money to are the people who work for him to help them buy houses, or for the people he's trading materials with. He's a very good businessman, and he understands you need a flow of cash to make deals. So he is elected to several municipal offices. He's hugely successful, financially and political. He's mayor of Stratford in 1968, and then he has a big downfall. Why? Because he's prosecuted for the crime of moneylending. So in 1570, he's accused of making loans to a Walter Mussman, probably someone who worked with him. And the loan he made him was equivalent to £50,000 in 2007, which was when they started working on this document again. And by 2016, we'd never updated the money. I would imagine it's already gone up quite a bit. We're probably talking about somewhere around £70,000 today. So it's a big loan, and it's a loan to someone he's not necessarily expecting to get paid back from. He's loaning money, yes, at interest, but that's the only way as a businessman you loan. And probably it's someone who needed the cash. But what happened for him doing that? Well, he lost his political aspirations. He lost his career. If I move on, the law at the time describes money lending as a vice most odious and detestable. Even those who money lend in a small way have severe penalties. So the law at the time is that you'll forfeit all the money, plus you'll forfeit the interest, face a hefty fine as well as possible imprisonment. We don't think John Shakespeare was imprisoned, but what we do know is that he was also engaged in trading wool illegally. He was trying to get around the middlemen. So it wasn't like he was stealing, it's just he was trying to cut out all the middlemen, but that was considered illegal. And he faced very severe penalties for these two crimes together. That document I show you outlines what happens to him. So there's court cases and fines that go over about 7 years. And in 1576, he completely withdraws from public life. He's lost all his money and he's now kind of in penury. So Shakespeare has a father who is a moneylender, who is criticised, who is punished for it. He and his father and his siblings are probably mistreated by people in the town because everyone loves a fall from grace. Okay. Why do I say that Shakespeare was probably on his father's side? So in 1569, before the downfall, John Shakespeare had applied for a coat of arms. You know, there's the big thing about him being honoured and the family being honoured by Henry VII. You know, there's a good reason to apply for a coat of arms to take him from an average middle class man to someone beginning to make his way up into the aristocracy. But that coat of arms, that heraldry, is not granted because after he applies, he's accused of usury, of lending money. And actually, the application lays dormant for 27 years until William Shakespeare earns some money. So Shakespeare has literary and financial success in London. What is the first thing he does with that success? He pays to have his father's great coat of arms granted. He redoes the application. It's one of the 6 known Shakespeare signatures is on this application for the coat of arms. And what you can see is there's a Shakespearean addition that can you see across the coat of arms, the spear, the Shakespeare is now a pen. It has a pen nib to it. So I would say a son who the first thing he does with his wealth is try and get back his father's status is a son who loved his father and a son who's trying to defend his father. Look at that date, 1596. Well, it's 4 years before John Shakespeare dies, but to me it has, and that's what everyone in the exhibition built around, you know, the love for a father, the Freudianness. What I thought was 1596. What else happened in 1596? Shakespeare starts working on The Merchant of Venice. So let's have a look at The Merchant of Venice. How do I know 1596? Well, it's been dated between these two dates. We can prove it because there's a reference in the play to a Spanish ship which was captured by the English at Cadiz in 1596. So it can't have been written before 1596. And it's mentioned by one of Shakespeare's friends in his letters and diaries in 1598. So it's got to be familiar and playing on stage by 1598. I've got the copyright dates for the very first version, the first printing. I told you about those bad quartos. And when it's then reproduced in a folio in 1600, it says it's been performed diverse times by that date. You know, here is the folio. And I think it's really interesting because whatever was intended by Shakespeare and the Lord Chamberlain's men, you can see here, acted by the Lord Chamberlain's servants, the way the printer, James Roberts and Thomas Hayes, describe it when they buy the copyright is that it's about the extreme cruelty of Shylock the Jew towards the said merchant. Okay, so however Shakespeare is writing it and how it's being read are two different things. So here I am going, Shakespeare is writing Shylock at the same time he's trying to redeem his father, the moneylender. However, those people who print the play don't see Shylock as the hurt moneylender. They see him as the cruel Jew. Okay. Let me go on. There's another reason that it's being written at that time, and that's because Shakespeare is riffing off the Jew of Malta. 1594, Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, which has a Jewish Barabbas, anti-heroine Barabbas, has been the most commercially successful play in the UK. Rose Theatre have made a fortune out of it. So partly Shakespeare is riding on that wave of anti-Semitism. So in The Merchant of Venice, he describes the Jews as the stock of Barabbas. You can see his plagiarizing the plot. You know, look at Barabbas's daughter. Okay. Oh, my girlie, my gold, my fortune, my felicity. That my girl, my gold, my fortune, you know, my daughter, my ducats, my daughter. You know, whether or not he knew Christopher Marlowe, people who are pure historians go, we can't prove they met. I go, you look at the text, it's clear he knew at least the text, but it's pretty obvious they must have met as well. You know, he's riffing off that, but he's doing something different because Barabbas in the Jew of Malta is unredeemed and unredeemable. Shylock, we Jews have a huge emotional resonance with. What has happened that makes Shakespeare redo the Jew of Malta as the Merchant of Venice? I don't think it's just the inspiration of redeeming his father, the moneylender, or kind of thinking, well, Christopher Marlowe is commercially successful. It's because it's a topic of the moment. So all those people who asked me, you are meeting the first of many Jews in London at the time, and I'm going to come back to him next week again, and probably the week after. But 1594, Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta has been a huge commercial success, and there is a treason trial happening, which ends in an execution. The treason trial of Rodrigo Lopez, who is Queen Elizabeth I's doctor. And I promise you, I will go into him in huge depth next week because he's a key figure. He hasn't been being treated as a Jew to this point because he's a converso. Portuguese Jew fleeing the Inquisition, post-Inquisition, comes to London. His father, in fact, was the doctor to the King of Portugal. We now know, one of the things we found out a few years ago is that he, for however much he was a converso or a hidden Jew, because this was before Jews were officially readmitted to England, he's sending money to his brother, and his brother found synagogues in Antwerp and later Vienna. So his brother Diego is a source of Rodrigo's money. It's pretty clear that Rodrigo marries a woman, Sarah, who is also a hidden Jew. She is from another New Christian family. Again, I will look at them all in depth next week. But what I'm saying is there is a trial where the Queen's doctor is accused of treason, and part of the argument to accuse him of treason, and we're going to unpick the whole trial, is that he's Jewish. And by the way, what does he say on the scaffold before his execution? He says, I'm as loyal to my lady, Queen Elizabeth, as I am to my Lord Jesus Christ. Read that whichever way you like. you know, two possible interpretations, right? Depending how you want to hear it. We'll take that on. But all this is brewing for Shakespeare. So is Shakespeare therefore just writing a villain, writing something that will attract the anti-Semitism of the time, which will sell well? I don't think so. I think, as we've all said, he's challenging it. And in my last 5 minutes, I'm going to show you why and introduce you to a few more of the figures we're going to unpick when we unpick Rodrigo Lopez and all those other people living cheek by jowl with Shakespeare in London. Okay. To unpick the next bit, I need to, I'll come back to that next week. Okay, to unpick the next bit, I want to look again at that language, because that language of "you spurned me such a day, you called me dog" appears in one other piece of Shakespeare's writing as well as Merchant of Venice. And it was how in 2016 we identified a speech in a play not in Shakespeare's first folio, so not in that complete text, as being by him. Have you ever heard of the play The Book of Sir Thomas More? You probably haven't, because it was not performed until 2016. Why? Written in 1600, we don't know who by, but someone who is not very good. It wasn't staged at the time because they thought it was too controversial. And what happened was several writers were brought in by the Crown to rework the piece. And we were looking at this during that 2016 preparation for the anniversary, and we were almost positive that Shakespeare wrote this speech. So what I'm showing you is Shakespeare's handwriting. One way we know is the handwriting itself. You know, I said there are 6 Shakespeare signatures. One was on the heraldry documents. One is on a court case I'm going to show you in a minute. So the writing itself gives us a clue, but the language gives us a clue. Shakespeare is the only writer of his time that turns nouns into verbs. I'm going to play you in a minute this speech, which he uses the verb shock. Okay, and he turns it into a verb. But it is full of language of spurning of dogs, of mistreatment of refugees, that is taken directly from Merchant of Venice. And I want to play you this, and I'm going to end with a summary of this, and why he wrote this and Merchant will form the basis of next week's session. So let me play. Let's see if I can do this. Is it going to work? No. My computer is not being very happy. Okay, let me try this. Here we go. So there was a gala performance alongside the exhibition, and Ian McKellen performed this speech and the BBC filmed it. And I want to play that for you.
In the British Library is a manuscript of a play about Henry VIII's Chancellor, Sir Thomas More. It's partly in Shakespeare's own handwriting. And this is the extraordinary speech he wrote as Thomas More quells a race riot in the City of London on May Day, appealing to the mob to consider the plight of the foreign immigrants.
The strangers should be removed! Grant them removed! And grant that this your noise hath kicked down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, with their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silenced by your brawl, and you, in ruff of your opinions, clothed. What have you got? I'll tell you, you had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reason, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes feed on one another. You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats,
possess their houses and lead the majesty of law, in lion to slip him like a hound, oh desperate as you are. Wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your unreverent knees make them your feet to kneel, to be forgiven. Say now the king, as he is clement, if the offender mourn, should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France, or Flanders, to any German province, Spain, or Portugal, and anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that, breaking out in hideous violence, would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owned not, nor made not you, nor that the elements were not all appropriate to your comfort, but chartered unto them. What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case. And this your mountainish inhumanity.
Okay, so here's the cliffhanger. Shakespeare publishes a play where a Jew says, the way you treat me isn't okay. If I am a villain, it's because of the way you treated me. And he writes a speech which isn't performed because it's too controversial, saying, if you were immigrants, if you were fleeing this country, how would you want to be received? Let's say in Spain or in Portugal. Would you want to be treated the way we treat and you are treating immigrants? Do you want to feel like you're a stranger going somewhere, to be spurned by a dog, spurned like a dog, to be called a cutthroat, to be attacked with knives, to have your property removed? Okay. If you thought that The Merchant of Venice was challenging for its time, how much more so is that speech I've just played you? Why? Why is Shakespeare writing like this in a world which I would say is even more charged for today? You know, I turn on my TV in England and I see Nigel Farage and rants about immigrants. I know what's going on in America with ICE. You know, you're imagining that kind of world, but more so. And Shakespeare is turning around someone who is born in England to a middle-class, assimilated Protestant family. Okay, his father's a moneylender and has lost his fortune, but why would he have the courage to turn around and challenge the majority? And to me, the answer is because where he lived in London. His lived experience was that the whole time he was writing plays, he was living surrounded by immigrants. He lived in a house of immigrants. He lived in a neighbourhood, not only where Ruy Lopez lived, that Jewish doctor I told you about, but many, many other significant converso families. Some of them were his friends. Some of them were his colleagues. One was probably his lover. And just like Henry Irving said, when you know someone, the way you portray them is very, very different. So next week, I'm going to take apart the geography of Shakespeare's neighbourhood in London and show you who we can prove he knew and associated with that probably influenced both those two speeches. And then the week after, we're going to look at some of those people's lives. So I hope that's given you a whetted appetite and an excitement about learning not only about Shakespeare, but about the Jews of the England he lived in. Thank you. And Callie, over to you for those other comments and questions if people have time.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for my new Shakespeare monologue. And it is already 8 past the hour. I think we can take literally one or two. I know Mitch has had his hand up for the whole time, so maybe we can hear Mitch's comment, and then call it a day. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. Yep.
Um, I don't know if you know Stephen Somers. He got his doctorate in Shakespeare at Oxford. He taught some classes at UCLA, which I took. And I asked him if Shakespeare was reflexive of the anti-Semitism in England. And he said, you couldn't be a Jew in England from like 1200 till the 1700s. So I thought it was interesting that he's using a Jewish character on that. And the other thing was the speech that you played with Pacino showing the humanity of being a Jew. I just have been astounded at the ending of the play, the devastation that ends with Shylock losing all of his money. His daughter marries a Christian, and he's left with nothing. And it seemed to be acceptable the way it was laid out. So I saw a real dichotomy from the speech of humanism, I'm a Jew, to just how his life ends.
Okay, so that is fantastic 2 questions. And both of them, I promise we'll go into in depth in the next 2 weeks. In fact, I promised Callie that I would teach Jessica because that is someone she's very interested in her story. And that's what you're referring to at the end, Mitch,
Right.
Shylock's. So I want to do that through the lens of looking at Ruy Lopez's family, because I think part of what influences the story of Jessica is the story of what happened to Ruy Lopez's family. Rodrigo Lopez. He's also known as Ruy, who is the doctor who is executed. And I think that's behind a lot of that devastation. So I promise you we'll do that next week. But I just want to take back because I think this whole series I'm doing is a challenge to that answer. Because if you look at the official history of England, Jews are expelled in 1290 and they are not officially readmitted until 1660s. Okay. However, first of all, there is no official readmission. That is an accidental myth that has come from some misreading of historical sources. So we did the 350th anniversary of the readmission, and I was working for the Board of Deputies at the time. I was the education officer for the Board of Deputies, so the Jewish representatives, and we put on this whole ceremony in Bevis Marks, the oldest synagogue in the UK, to have speakers go, yeah, but this is a false anniversary because there was never really a readmission, it's all a lie. So I will unpick that for you. But because of that gap, that's the standard way English history has been taught, English Jewish history. The problem is, first of all, there were Jews who probably never left but became hidden Jews, just like we know happened in the Inquisition with the Spanish and Portuguese. We also know that there were people who came in fleeing the Inquisition, came to England and became hidden Jews in England. That's where Ruy Lopez's family came in. But more than that, and what I'm going to explore definitely in week 3 and probably a little bit next week, is Henry VIII brought over Italian Jews, particularly Venetian Jews. How does Shakespeare know about Venice? No, I argue with Professor Jonathan Bate. It's not because Shakespeare spent his missing years in Venice, the modern city. It's because in his players, his musicians in the court are Venetian Jews who are talking about that experience. And we know them, we have their documented lives. The musicians' instruments are in Oxford. You know, we've got engravings and wood cuttings, we've got their published writings. So that whole idea that there were no Jews in England in that period is a fallacy. And by the way, all the Jews they were, these hidden Jews, were marrying each other, being baptized and buried in a church. It was known as the Conversos Church. There's lots of evidence that this is where all these families were, and many of them were living Jewish lives or sending money home to Jews in other countries too. And that church was a 5-minute walk from Shakespeare's house in London. So I will show you that when I do the geography. So yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, that's a great teaser to come back next week. I hope we'll see all of you there. And thank you so much, Aviva. That was awesome. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Lovely to see you. See you next week.